Spotlight on Native Americans, Comanche. The First Peoples. Chapter 1. More than 500 Native American groups make their home in the United States, with even more living in Canada. The Comanches are a people who live in Oklahoma. But who are Native Americans, and how do Comanches fit into the history of North America's native people? Ancestors of Native Americans migrated, or moved to North America more than 12,000 years ago, probably at a time when sea levels were low enough to uncover dry land in the area between northeastern Asia and Alaska. The first peoples in North America moved around the continent in small groups, hunting wild animals and collecting a wide variety of plant foods. They developed separate cultures based on their environments. Over time, some started to grow crops, which allowed for the development of settlements and permanent housing. It wasn't until around AD 1500 that European ships reached North America. The newcomers brought guns and horses, which were a threat, but also were useful to the Comanche. The Comanche lifestyle began to change, and they were suddenly brought into the conflict with Europeans and with other native peoples. Comanche Origins, Chapter 2. The origin of the Comanche is an important story that's been passed down for hundreds of years. It tells of a time when great swirling winds from the four directions kicked up dust in a giant storm. The wind created people with the power of storms and the strength of the earth from which they'd been made. Some think the Comanche name is of Spanish origin, Camino Ancho. This means the broad trail, which refers to the trails the Comanches used for raids. Others think it comes from the Utah word that means enemy. The Comanches called themselves Nurm, sometimes Numinu, Neum, or Nununa, which means the people or people of people. In the 1600s, the Comanches migrated from what's new central Wyoming to areas in modern-day Colorado and Kansas. Finally, they moved to the southern Great Plains. In the 1700s and 1800s, the Comanches were a powerful presence in the southern Great Plains, in an area that stretched from present-day eastern New Mexico across central Oklahoma and southern Kansas to today's central Texas. They guarded their land and led bloody raids that stretched even into Mexico. Comanches on the Move, Chapter 3. The Comanches were originally hunters and gatherers who lived in the northern Rocky Mountains in Wyoming. They hunted elk and deer on foot. However, when the Europeans brought horses in the late 1600s, the Comanche lifestyle changed. On horseback, the Comanche became great bison hunters who were able to follow and attack large herds. This change began the Comanche migration south as they followed bison herds. By the early 1700s, the Spanish began encountering Comanches in what is now southeastern Colorado. The Comanche migration alarmed the Spanish because it threatened to upset Native American relations in New Mexico. The Spanish had made friends with the Plains Apaches, but they were in danger of being driven off the southern Great Plains by the arrival of the Comanches. The Plains Apaches asked for help from the Spanish, who built a fort for them. Nothing could stop the Comanches, though. They numbered in the thousands. Around 1724, bands of Plain Apaches fought in a great battle against the Comanches, but they lost. In the years following, Comanches gained complete control of the southern Great Plains. Comanches and the Spanish, Chapter 4. During the mid-1700s, the Spanish lived in settlements in the regions that are now Texas and New Mexico. They were prime targets for Comanche raids. There were so many Comanches and so few Spanish soldiers that Comanches raided Spanish ranches at will, stealing horses by the thousands. In 1787, fighting ended when the Comanches became military allies of the Spanish in New Mexico. For the time, there was peace in the region. The Comanches helped the Spanish fight the Apaches, the former allies of the Spanish. The Apaches began raiding Spanish cattle herds after the Comanches had taken the bison off the plains. The peace between the Spanish and the Comanches ended during the Mexican War of Independence, which lasted from 1810 to 1821. After the Spanish settlers won their independence from Spain and formed Mexico, Comanches no longer saw them as allies and returned to their raids. In 1848, the United States defeated Mexico in a war and acquired New Mexico as a territory. In 1845, Texas also became a U.S. state. The Comanches had a new and more powerful enemy to fight. United States takes over, Chapter 5. As Texas and New Mexico came under U.S. authority, new conflicts began. In the beginning, the United States mostly defended itself from attacks. The U.S. Army built a line of forts across the Texas frontier. However, that didn't stop the Comanches from traveling around the region. After the American Civil War, the U.S. Army became more aggressive. Large armies defeated some Comanche bands. The Comanches were forced to move to a reservation under the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867. Under the treaty, the U.S. government promised to provide Comanches with food, but the United States didn't hold up to that part of the deal. Many Comanches returned to the plains. In 1874, the U.S. Army launched a massive campaign, with many soldiers coming from forts in all directions. The soldiers had cannons and an early kind of machine gun. The Comanches were forced to flee their villages, which the soldiers burned. That winter, when the Comanches were starving and freezing, they had no choice but to surrender. U.S. hide hunters killed the rest of the bison, forcing the Comanches to give up their way of life. Forced from their land, Chapter 6. The Comanches, who had once ridden freely across the Great Plains, found themselves stuck in present-day southwestern Oklahoma. Their reservation was located near the dry, rocky Wichita Mountains on land that wasn't suitable for farming. The United States forced them to become farmers anyway. Comanche children were taken to schools far away to break them of their customs and traditions. Although U.S. treaties promised that Comanches would have their reservations forever, the land was soon given to the white settlers. In 1892, Congress forced the Comanche to accept individual ownership of small farms. The rest of the land was sold. The 1900s were a hard time for the Comanches. Americans forced them to assimilate or become more like white people, and their culture was nearly lost. In 1907, the Comanches were forced to become citizens of the state of Oklahoma. The U.S. government argued that the Comanche Nation no longer existed. It wasn't until 1934 that the government allowed Comanches to officially join the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache peoples to form a sort of government for themselves. In the 1960s, the Comanches were finally able to organize their own nation. Comanche Division and Partnership, Chapter 7. It wasn't until they were forced to live on a reservation that the Comanches formed one political identity. Over the past several hundred years, they sometimes had as few as 3 tribal divisions, and sometimes as many as 12. Each operated as an independent unit with the different territories on the Bison Plains. By the mid-1800s, they had 6 divisions: Quahada, antelope; the Pintakas, honey eaters; and Tanawa, downstream people; Nokoni, wanderers; Katsotakas, buffalo eaters; and Yamparika, root eaters. Each warrior society was capable of organized military efforts, unlike many other plains people. The Kiowa people were strong allies of the Comanches. Around 1790, the Comanches and the Kiowas declared peace with each other. The two groups traveled, hunted, and fought together against common enemies. However, they couldn't have been more different. The Kiowas thought the Comanches were too hot-headed, while the Comanches thought the Kiowas would rather talk about a problem than face it. Despite those differences, they remained great partners for many years. Comanche Traditions, Chapter 8. Bison were a key part of the traditional Comanche way of life. In fact, the Comanches' traditional economy was based on hunting the great herds of bison on the southern Great Plains. The bison provided for almost all the Comanches' needs, from bowstring to glue. Bison meat provided more than fresh food. It could also be stored for winter food or trail food. Comanches cut the meat into thin strips, salted it, and hung it in the sun to make dried meat that would last a long time. Comanches used bison skin or hides to make the clothing and warm winter blankets. They also used it to make teepees and homes they could move from place to place. Bison meat and hides gave the Comanches valuable items for trade, especially with the Spanish and the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico. The Comanches also traded horses. They had a seemingly endless supply of horses from their raids to sell to native groups farther north, all the way to Canada. From the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s, Comanches may have been the wealthiest and most powerful Native American group around. Comanche Creations, Chapter 9. The Comanches weren't focused only on hunting and raiding, however. They also created beautiful works of art. Comanches were skilled at making parfleches, which are finely crafted containers made of tanned elk hide. Colored with natural dyes and decorated with beadwork and porcupine quills, many parfleches are masterpieces. The Comanches also created clothing using deer and elk hides. Their shirts, dresses, and moccasins were finely crafted and beautifully decorated. Comanches took great pride in their appearance. Many of the historic craft items in museums and private collections were stolen from families during the period when Comanches were being forced to accept reservation life. Soldiers, Native American agents, and settlers stole items. Traditional clothing was taken from Comanche children when they were forced to attend boarding school. Many of those items ended up in museums. The Comanches also created games. One traditional example is a dice game, made with dice carved from pieces of bone. One of their favorite games was called the hand game, which involved teams of players hiding a small object from each other. Comanche Beliefs, Chapter 10. The Comanches are a very spiritual people, and their beliefs affect their everyday lives. Traditional Comanches believe in an afterlife and worship the Great Spirit. They seek visions to help guide them in life. Medicine men were very important figures in Comanche culture. They treated illness, interpreted dreams, and guided the nation in times of crisis. However, in 1874, a young Comanche medicine man, Isate, told people that if the Comanches held a sun dance, they would be safe from the bullets of the American hide hunters. The Comanches performed the dance and then attacked a group of hide hunters at Adobe Walls, Texas. Several Comanches were shot. After this, Comanches medicine men lost much of their influence with the people. Many Native American peoples have stories that connect them to their past and to nature. One Comanche story tells of a character named Coyote that wanted to release bison from a creature called Humpback, who kept all bison caged. Coyote tricked Humpback into thinking he was a puppy Humpback's son could have had as a pet. Coyote went into Humpback's dwelling and released the bison for all native people to use. Comanche Nation of Oklahoma, Chapter 11. The Comanche people of today live a very different life than those of the past, but they try to keep their heritage alive. For nearly 100 years after the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, the Comanches were formally joined with the Kiowa and the Kiowa Apache peoples. During much of the 1900s, they worked together in a business committee made up of representatives from each group. However, in 1963, the Comanches organized the Comanche Nation of Oklahoma. Their headquarters is located north of the small city of Lawton, near the Wichita Mountains of southwestern Oklahoma. Today, around half of the nation's 15,000 members live in this region. The nation elects its leaders every 3 years and even has its own license plates. Ever since 1901, when the government forced Comanches to have small individual farms instead of shared land, the Comanches have been scattered throughout their former reservation. They often mix in with the population of small towns in southwestern Oklahoma. Most children attend public schools. Some Comanches even moved away from the area to find a new life. Finding Success, Chapter 12. Today, some Comanches use their creativity to express concerns and issues shared by many Native Americans. Comanche writer Cornell Penwarty is one of the most active Native American writers trying to get Americans to stop using Native Americans as mascots for sports teams. His articles on that issue have appeared in many publications. He's currently a professor of Native American Studies at Portland State University in Oregon. Penwarty also performs traditional Comanche flute music. Comanche poet Juanita Padoponi has been an inspiration to young Comanche writers. She is a renowned poet, artist, and teacher. Comanche actor Gil Birmingham acted in the Twilight movies as the character Billy Black. Paul Chatt-Smith co-authored one of the most influential books about the American Indian movement, AIM, of the late 1960s and early 1970s. His book, Like a Hurricane, described how AIM members staged protests in the United States that brought worldwide attention to the poverty and hopelessness on many reservations. In 2001, Smith became associate curator of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Keeping Culture Alive, Chapter 13. Though the Comanches faced persecution for many years, their culture is very much alive. In the last few decades, they've experienced a cultural revival. After over a century of intense attempts by the U.S. government to make them give up their traditional ways and blend into the larger European American culture, Comanches are now allowed to publicly embrace their traditions again. It's a huge change from their years of suffering, when most Americans assumed that both the Comanche people and their culture would disappear forever. In 1972, one of the old Comanche warrior societies, the Little Pony Society, was revived to honor returning Comanche Vietnam War veterans. In 1976, the Yamparika division of the Comanches revived their Black Knives Society. Once made up of some of the best warriors in the nation, those societies have been inactive for nearly a century. While many Comanches are reestablishing their cultural roots, others have become part of the wider American society. The most valuable resources of the Comanche Nation is its people. They have endured enormous hardships and have survived. Today, the Comanche Nation looks to the future with hope for their continued greatness. Spotlight on Native Americans, Comanches.